Okay, so we're going to start, but I have to do this thing for my therapist real quick. Breakfast. No. Well, I'm a little excited. This is an app that I use that my therapist is making me use for my eating disorder, just so I can keep track of how I'm feeling and if I eat or not. So that's out of the way.
Hungry and terrifying creatures lurk in the alleys and woods of Mexico. So if you're thinking of visiting, I'll tell you about a few things you might see. This is Darkness Prevails, the best place to share your scariest true stories with the world, because this world is a strange one. Mexico has a wonderful and colorful culture. But with any culture comes legends, tales, stories of myths and monsters alike, of boogeymen and ghosts. Tonight, we take a look at some allegedly real sightings of monsters from Mexico. Before we begin, remember, you can always send me your stories with the links in the description. I'm looking for real-life dinosaur sightings and haunted forest stories. Also, think about buying one of my shirts on morbidmonsters.com. Represent Darkness Prevails and support me at the same time. Thank you. Real quick, here are the first 5 interesting comments from my previous video. Kane7ify says, they get you for low prices. Sorry Kane, I can't say that word because of YouTube. But, Craigslist is definitely a hunting ground for certain kinds of freaks. GG Gamer Gain says, so darn close to a top comment. It made me laugh, so I had to put it in here. Congratulations, GG Gamer. Or should I say, GG. Savage Marrow says, will someone buy my kidney? I need money for Candy Crush. Sure, man, I'll give you my 3rd one. That might be a tumor, actually. I should probably get that looked at. Anyway. George Salesa says, I love your stuff, dude. Wish you had some military scary stories. Keep up the good work. I've done a few videos on that topic, but I would love to do it again. Those are some of my favorite stories. And Omnimon, concerning Craigslist, says, Craig doesn't like his list anymore. At least they didn't call it Schindler's List, I guess. Now, let's see what's hiding in the bushes of Mexico. Number 1. The Observer. Submitted by Nostalgia. First off, I need to say that this isn't my own story. I know that can make it sound like it may be doubtful, but I promise it's true. This was told to me by 2 of the people in the world I trust most, my 2 cousins, in complete honesty and fear. One night, my family gathered for a carne asada. It's like a barbecue. We were eating and sharing stories. Then my cousin, Danny, asked in all seriousness, "Do you want to hear a scary thing that happened to me and Elisa, her sister?" And of course, you don't say no to something like that. Me and several others were very interested, and we were listening intently to their story. She begins. She was washing the dishes in the afternoon. A window sits right in front of the sink, looking out over the yard. All of a sudden, she sees someone walk across the window, right in front of it. It looked like Elisa. She was even wearing her favorite yellow teddy bear shirt, but she was strange, oddly stiff, as if she didn't know how to act in her own body. She continued across the yard and out of the window's view. Danny, thinking she's going to go to the back door to enter the house, waits to hear her come inside, but she never hears anything. Instead, she hears the bathroom door open, and to her horror, that's Elisa, and she's coming out casually smiling. She tries to explain what she just saw to Elisa, that she saw her outside, and that there was no way she could have been coming from the bathroom. But Elisa doesn't believe her, and passes it off as her imagining something or just seeing shadows. Months later, Danny experienced another bizarre encounter. This time, she was out in the city center in San Luis with her friends after school. They were trying to get a taxi when one of her friends interrupts the chatting and gets her attention. "Hey, isn't that Elisa?" she says, pointing across the road. Danny, confused, looks across to see her sister at the bus stop, among other people. She's standing there, furiously waving, stiffly with large eyes and a forced large smile on her face. It was eerie, not normal, not Elisa. It was like she wanted her attention urgently. Danny waved awkwardly back, unsure of how to respond exactly. When the taxi arrived and they got in, everyone was equally confused and freaked out. They all knew Elisa hated the bus. She felt it was disgusting and not to her standard. She would never be riding in one, let alone trying to show others she was riding one. They argue about whether that was her, but Danny assures it was. It looked physically like her sister anyway. It just didn't behave like her, as if she was possessed. The last encounter didn't happen for a few years. Danny was now married, and her husband Marco, and Elisa were all going to be staying in their childhood home, which is also where the initial window encounter had happened. Danny and her husband were sleeping in her old bedroom. It was dark and had 2 beds. After a long nap, she gets up and heads for the bathroom, which is to the right of her room. Before she goes to open the door, she feels the need to look toward the small living room, located to the left of their room with the front door between. The house wasn't large, and the living room was visible from her doorway. She turns to look, and standing there is Elisa, but she knew right away it was the other Elisa. She calls her name anyway, just in case. "Elisa?" And this thing stares at Danny. It stares hard at her, as if she had been caught red-handed. Danny was so frightened, she said she couldn't even move. Then the fake Elisa reacted. It bent itself, like when you're pretending to be a dinosaur. Its legs bent and its arms pulled inwards. Danny said she felt cold all of a sudden, like everything inside her had frozen. and she couldn't breathe. Then the thing tilted its head and jumped. Yes, she said it jumped like some sort of kangaroo. It looked so unnatural and forced, bizarre for any person to ever do. It quickly reached her, and they were face to face, inches apart, and it began to scream. Danny felt like she was going to pass out and yelled, "Yvette, get out!" Danny then heard a door behind her open, and there was Elisa. She looked just as confused. Danny looked awful, and Elisa rushed over to see what was wrong. She looked pale and sick, and she couldn't speak, only cry. But the thing that had been Elisa, it was gone. Finally, after a few hours, she calmed down enough to explain what happened to Elisa and Marcos, who also was worried and confused. She tried to retell what happened as calmly as she could. Elisa believed in her encounters after hearing about the bus incident from her and Danny's friends. That's when Danny's husband Marco added in an extra eerie note to the story. He says that while he and Danny were sleeping, he woke up in the middle of the night and saw someone standing in their room. It was Elisa. He figured she was back from shopping, so he didn't pay much mind. But then she walked closer, leaned over Marco, and strangely looked towards Danny, eyes wide and quizzical. After a few minutes, Elisa retreated and headed for the closet next to the bed. Then, once in there, began furiously going through everything, thrashing clothes and throwing things out, looking at one thing then another. Then he knew it wasn't Elisa, the way it suddenly stiffened up and walked out of the room, as if this was its first experience moving with a human body. Marco tried to assume it was Elisa, checking to see if Danny was still sleeping and went to look for something, though it was impossible to ignore the way she acted and moved. They haven't seen this mimic creature since, and they don't know where it came from, or why it copied Elisa and haunted Danny. As we discussed it, I stated that it may have been an alien or something trying to learn from her and understand her lifestyle, or some sort of Mexican skinwalker. Either way, this was a very bizarre experience, and it's very troubling to know there are things out there that can easily disguise themselves as your loved ones. For what reason, I don't think we'll ever know. Not unless it's too late. Number 2. Never walk alone at night in Mexico. Submitted by Ray A. The following is my dad's story, and it's from his point of view. I was 19 or 20 years old when this happened. It happened one night in my village in Guanajuato, in Mexico. I was out drinking and playing cards with a couple of friends. After a few hours, it had gotten really late. I believe it was 12 or 1 in the morning. Anyway, I said my goodbyes, and I began to walk back to my mom's house. That night was eerily quiet and dark, but I was a bit drunk, so it didn't bother me too much. As I was walking up the path to get home, I felt as if something was looking at me. I thought it was just me being tipsy, but something told me to turn around anyway. I listened, and as soon as I did, I regretted my decision. This big black dog appeared out of nowhere. I know it wasn't on the path or the neighboring houses, but it wasn't just that the dog appeared out of thin air. Its eyes were 2 round red lights. It looked like 2 eyes on fire with no pupils, redder than firewood burning. I stood there, frozen, trying to comprehend what I was seeing. But as my eyes started to look down to its feet, my heart skipped a beat, and my eyes almost bulged from my head. The dog was floating. Where its legs were supposed to be, there was nothing there. Kind of like an incomplete picture someone didn't finish. I was trying to figure out what the heck this was in front of me. Just then, the dog thing started to growl. Its red eyes locked onto me. I panicked, and I started to run home. The path was on a steep, rocky hill. I don't know how, but I ran and didn't trip. Maybe it was the panic and adrenaline. But I could hear the thing's paws running on the path behind me, coming after me. But like I said, the dog was floating and didn't have paws, so how did I hear its steps? I could hear him growling and barking just behind me, so I kept running full speed, hoping it wouldn't get me. I reached the gate, swung open the door, closed it, and ran straight to my room. My heart was racing, and I was so exhausted from the drinking and the running. I sat there thinking, what in the world just chased me? It was not a normal dog. Dogs don't float and have red circles for eyes and no pupils. After some time and thinking, I fell asleep, and I tried to put it all behind me. The next morning, I talked to my mom about it. Hesitant, she told me most likely it was the devil in dog's form. He tends to take different forms to roam the earth, looking for mischievous people roaming at night. If he had caught up to me, she said, he would take you to hell for all of eternity. Needless to say, I reevaluated my life choices up to then. I decided then and there to change. I stopped gambling, drinking out late and getting drunk. Not to mention a few years later I would get married. This was my dad's story. He had always been a serious yet loving father. So when he told me this story, I 100% believed him. Why would he lie about something like this? I could see the fear in his eyes as he recounted the story. He's usually so hard, stern, and brave. It's hard to see him act this way. It was very surprising. To this day, he still finds it hard to believe what he saw that night. Was his mother right? Was it really the devil in dog form? Or was he just that drunk? Did he imagine the whole incident? I'm telling this story not to scare you, but to give you a warning. Remember, there are things that creep at night, and it's not just bad people. And it's not just bad people that try to find new victims. Because when you walk alone at night in Mexico, you might come face to face with the devil himself. Number 3. Strange creature in the forests of Mexico. Submitted by Arian. I lived along the coast where California and Mexico touch, and I was 14 years old at the time of this story. My cousin and little brother decided to go camping. Overall, at the start, we were having a fun time. We were making jokes and eating junk food like hot Cheetos, until we heard slight crackling noises, like an anvil was falling on sticks. And that got us alarmed, as we thought a bear was going to attack us. So my cousin went out with a big hunting knife, and though he was brave and thought he was bigger than he actually was, he soon came back screaming and tearing up. He told me after he settled down that he saw a white, pale creature with bony fingers and limbs. He said it moved like a dog and looked like one almost, except that it didn't have a tail or ears, not even fur. He said it was horrifying and disfigured, which eventually I did believe him about the story. The way he was talking so smoothly, and how he was acting scared. But another part of me didn't want to believe the story. At this point, we're all freaking out. I personally wanted to get the heck out of there. So around 8:30 p.m., we had been packing everything up and we got finished up by 9. At that moment, we were happy to be almost out of there. But then we all heard movement in the bushes, and our panicking only grew worse. When we started to head out of the forest, we heard something, more cracking of sticks, and now breathing. very audible breathing. Now, I was scared to see what he described, yet there it was, looking at me and my cousin and brother. That hideous thing, exactly as my cousin had described it. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. That moment of realization that the nightmare you just heard was in fact real. My cousin dropped everything at the sight of it, too scared to even attack. When it opened its mouth and let out that blood-curdling scream, we all ran back to the car. I will never forget what I saw that night. I never want to see it again. It's been a while since we went camping for obvious reasons, but we're planning on going back in a few months. But this time, when we do go back, we'll have some sort of protection to fire at that thing. Number 4. Little Creatures from Mexico. Submitted by Al. My mother has told me this story various times, especially since it's one of my favorites. Not too long ago, around 3 years ago, I received a phone call late in the evening from a relative in Mexico. I asked her what it was about, and she told me she would tell me in the morning. The next day I asked her about it, and she replied in Spanish, "If I tell you, you better not come to me at night saying you're scared." Immediately curious, I promised that I wouldn't. But of course, that was a lie, and even as a grown adult, I still seek her protection when I'm scared and think of this story. She told me that her niece, who was an infant, was staying in my grandma's house for a while, and one day, in the middle of the night, my grandma and my uncles and aunts awoke to the sound of small bells and laughter, the sound of feet running around her small adobe home. In Mexico, duendes are known to make these sounds, and are notorious for claiming the souls of children, especially when the child had not been properly protected while having crossed a river with their parents. And in fact, earlier that day, they had passed by the river near my grandma's house, without even bothering to protect the child from the duendes. They had forgotten the words of advice many elders have told them before. Adults are usually warned not to bring children in or around rivers, since chanos, duendes, goblins, elves, and gnomes, are notorious for kidnapping children, and, as I said before, the souls of infants. If a person were to cross the river with their child infant, without saying, "Don't stay in the river or the chanos will take you," they're in danger. The infant's soul is usually stuck in the river, and the infant will cry throughout the night until the duendes, goblins, elves, and chanos retrieve the infant from its home. In order to prevent this from happening, you must go back with the infant and speak those words at the river you crossed with the child in your arms. There is also a plant called jara. It grows along the rivers that protects the child's soul from staying in the water. According to many elders, the infant child must be wearing it for the chant or words to work. My aunts and uncles had ignored the sounds of the chanos, and they went back to sleep, thinking nothing of it at the time. The next morning, they had found her by the door. Her niece had been dragged out of her bed and placed at the front door. My grandma believes the chanos tried taking her back to the river, since it was impossible for the newborn to crawl from her mother's bed to the door that was near the other side of the house. I honestly fear these creatures, and I know I will have to visit my grandma one day, and that gives me chills, especially since aliens, duendes, demons, and lechuza, and pretty much anything you can think of, are known inhabitants of that rural area in which my grandma lives. I don't think I'll be too excited to get there. Number 5. Monster in Mexico. Submitted by Jocelyn. I used to go to the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico all the time. The number one place I'd go is the Yucatan Forest, It's a family tradition to camp there, so a few years ago we decided to camp at a different part of the forest, somewhere new. We unpacked all our camping supplies and set everything up. I was 15 years old at the time, and I got to use my own tent and gear, and I was excited. Once me and my family set everything up, it was already getting late, so we all went into our tents. Pretty soon, everybody was asleep, except for me. I just couldn't sleep with all the animals howling and chirping. And then, I'll never forget it, all the sounds of the night just stopped, all at once, as if someone had pulled the record from the turntable. It was so weird. I sat up and opened my tent, trying to be as quiet as possible. Now that everything was silent, every move I made was so loud. Eventually, I stood in front of my tent, waiting for any other noise to erupt, for the sounds of nighttime to come back. But I heard nothing. A few minutes later, I heard something terrifying, like a horrid mix of howl and screaming and the groans of a man. Once I heard it, I froze. The sound was everywhere, but I knew where it was coming from, because I could see the source of it. In front of me was a 9-foot-tall creature. It almost resembled a man. It had no arms, its whole eyes were pitch black, and its teeth were so sharp that alone was enough to make me cry. As I cried, the creature stared at me. It felt like hours before I heard the thing break the silence. Leave. It spoke to me, in English, in human words. I'll come again if you're not gone. Then it turned and limped awkwardly back into the woods. I was still standing there, frozen and crying. I didn't know what to do. I stayed put until my sister finally came out, and that's when the animals continued their howls and chirps. Everything was back to normal. My sister asked me if I was okay. I looked at her, shook my head, and we went into her tent and went to sleep. The next morning, because I was too afraid to tell anyone what actually happened, I instead told my mother that I was beginning to feel really sick and that I was ready to go home. This saddened her, but she had to do what she had to do for her child. After we left, I was so relieved, and since then, I refused to go back to the Yucatan forests. Maybe you should do the same. And number 6, Mexican Monster Story, submitted by Alex R. This story is from my dad. My old man was a poor child living in Mexico City in the 80s. He was always in the need for some quick cash. Suddenly, his aunt and uncle called to ask him if he could watch his cousins for the night while his aunt and uncle went to a party, or something along those lines. To give some idea of the layout of the place, his aunt and uncle lived in a small house on the outskirts of Mexico City. He put his cousins to bed that night, hoping the rest of the evening would go smoothly. Little did he know, that night would be one of the scariest and worst nights of his life. He went up to his aunt's room to sleep, but right when he was drifting off, he heard what sounded like footsteps on the roof, right away jolting him awake. He said he thought it was a cat or another small animal, but as the steps continued, he realized they were far too heavy to be any small creature. Terrified of a house intruder, he went to his uncle's closet, where there were multiple weapons. He grabbed this 1911 pistol out of the safe and hurried to wake his cousins up, to tell them to hide in the closet while he would check outside for the intruder. Keep in mind, my dad was 16 at the time, and his cousins were about 8, so he wasn't afraid to go outside and face the intruder. He also called the police, but since they were further away from the main city, the dispatcher told him it would take about 20 minutes for authorities to arrive. Until then, my dad was in control of the situation. But my dad, wanting to be a hero, he went outside and began to yell at whoever was on the roof, saying that he would fire on them and that police were on their way. He was trying to scare whoever it was off. So he went checking around the house, but whenever he got to the backyard, he caught a glimpse of the roof, and what he saw there, he said it terrified him for months, and still puzzles him to this day. This is how he attempted to describe it. An extremely hairy humanoid figure, with hooves for feet, and a hellish complexion. He wasted no time dropping his weapon and sprinting back inside, closing everything, praying for the police to come sooner. He told me he was so scared, he was crying and shaking next to his cousins in the closet. Police finally arrived, searching and taking statements from him and his cousins. Even though he was telling the truth, no one believed him. Before they left that night, one of the cops even told him that he was straight up crazy. My dad is now 38 years old, and he's living in the hill country of Texas, playing it safe, trying to stay far away from whatever that horrid creature may have been. My dad doesn't know what he saw, and the thought of the sight of it nags at him in the back of his mind every day. It's the kind of thing you pray to never see again, unless you don't value your sanity. There are things of this world that I don't think any of us could understand. Mexico may be a beautiful country, with a rich heritage and some downright delicious food, but it still has its monsters. Sure, there are bad people that make others' lives a living hell, but there are also monsters straight from your nightmares, straight from a scary movie. Creatures that might make you realize that you are the delicious food I was just talking about. Yes. Could I get extra tortillas, please? Good night. Be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. Don't forget to send me your dinosaur sightings and haunted forest stories soon, using the links in the description. Also, check out morbidmonsters.com for some amazing cool merchandise, and everything's under $20, and it supports this channel. Thank you for listening. Stay safe out there, and stay creepy.
Now I almost win. What? Ay, so close. Turd. Oh my god. I took 11%. Okay, well, I'm gonna end it here. I'm tired. Okay, bye.